I want you all to know that you've joined the Targeted Grazing online workshop for 2015. Actually, this series will continue on into 2016. Believe it or not, that was just right around the corner. So I am going to just give you a little bit of information about this online series, and then we'll go back to this great topic of livestock and wildlife interactions, and especially ways to use grazing to improve and manage wildlife habitat. So, John, this has been a great discussion here. I'm really kind of whetting my appetite for what you speakers might say. We started the Targeted Grazing online workshops about a year ago, I think, right, John? A year and a half ago.
Yeah, I believe that's right.
We started out with a series on principles, so if you wanted to look back at our series on the principles of targeted grazing, that's available at our website. So I'm going to tell you a little bit more about what our committee does and how you might look at other webinars in the series. So our main sponsors for this series are the Rangeland Center, where I work, the research lab in the Northern Great Plains Research Lab, where John works, the Texas A&M AgriLife Experiment Station in San Angelo, where John Walker, who was also on our committee, works, and then the American Sheep Industry Association. So if you work somewhere that wants to be a sponsor of our series, I think that's a trend. Okay, so let me tell you a little bit more about what we do. We, as you probably know, the Society for Range Management is a group of practitioners, land managers, researchers, extension specialists, personnel, anyone interested in managing grazing or managing rangelands. The Targeted Grazing Committee is just a subset of those people who really seek professional development and continuing education focused on targeted grazing. So I really would encourage you all to go to rangelands.org, which is the Society for Range Management. Look at the great things that society does to enhance and promote understanding and management of rangelands. And then, of course, our Targeted Grazing Committee, which is, we have a website called targetedgrazing.wordpress.com, where we house our previous webinar series and other things that we do. I see there's an error here. The website for the Society for Range Management is rangelands with an S.org, so rangelands.org. I hope you'll migrate over there. Some of the things that we do, we're doing these online workshops. There's about 5 in a series. This particular series is called On the Ground, and as you know, they start kind of around lunchtime on Thursdays throughout the year. We're also working on a scientific paper on grazing as a restoration tool. We created the Targeted Grazing Wikipedia page. We kind of merged the conservation grazing page with targeted grazing. So if you go to Wikipedia, that was us that tried to create that. We have a YouTube channel where we house all our videos. You can we can follow your projects on Instagram with hashtag targeted grazing, or you can send us an email at targetedgrazing@gmail.com. So also, if you are in the Society for Range Management and are a continuing professional, so if you want continuing education units as a professional in rangeland management, we can track your progress in this workshop. You just need to go to our website, look under training, and look for CEUs. So again, this is a 15-16 workshop series. We started with setting realistic objectives for targeted grazing projects. Last week we talked about some issues or some ways to use targeted grazing and consider endangered species in project areas. Today we're going to look at livestock and wildlife interactions. In January we will talk about multi-species grazing, and I will end the series with discussion about communicating and contracting. So how do you sell targeted grazing as an option, and how do you contract that? Okay, and so this series, this particular webinar was put together by John Hendrickson. John is the chair of the Targeted Grazing Committee. Ever since I've known you, John, we've talked about targeted grazing. It's something that goes way back in your history. You're currently involved in research with invasive grasses, which is pretty interesting work. Many of you know that the Targeted Grazing Handbook is available. It's available for download on our website or through the American Sheep Industry Association. And John Hendrickson is the one that wrote the chapter on plant response in that handbook. Currently, John works as a rangeland scientist at the Northern Great Plains Research Laboratory in Mandan, and he previously was a research scientist at the ARS station in DuBois, which is where I met him. So, John, are you ready? I'm going to pass you the presenter role.
Okay.
Okay, I'm passing it to you. It's all yours, John. Just go full screen. It looks good to us.
Okay, all right. Well, we're going to have three presenters today, and we're going to start off with Cammie Dixon. Cammie is with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and she's always had a strong interest in restoring and reconstructing prairie here in the northern Great Plains. Cammie works as a regional biologist for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, so she works with a lot of refugees across North and South Dakota. She provides information on science-based management for fish and wildlife lands. And as long as I've known Cammie, she's always really been a strong advocate for trying to improve rangelands and prairies that the Fish and Wildlife Service monitor. Before her current job, Cammie worked as a biologist for the Natural Resources Conservation Service in Jamestown, North Dakota. And just a quick comment for everyone who is listening, what we're planning on doing is that we have one set of slides, and then occasionally you'll hear next slide, and I'll advance them for Cammie. So with that, I'll turn it over to Cammie.
All right, thank you, John. First of all, a thank you to John and Karen for putting together this session, and I appreciate the invite to be part of this and be able to share with you managing prairies for wildlife on U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service-owned prairies. I do want to mention that I work across North Dakota, South Dakota, and into northeastern Montana, so that will be my point of reference for my presentation today. I also want to acknowledge my silent co-presenter today is Lori Richardson, who is a biologist with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service up at Lostwood National Wildlife Refuge. Before we go on as well, I also just want to talk about the establishing legislation for our lands, mainly here in the Dakotas. Of course, we have a wildlife focus, that's pretty obvious in our name, but one of the specifics in our establishing legislation is to provide habitat for migratory birds and nesting birds here in the Dakotas. So you'll hear me talk a lot about birds. Of course, we want to provide habitat for all wildlife, and specifically in recent years, we've really been focusing on the pollinators and insects. So I'm ready for the next slide. First of all, I wanted to talk a little bit about a historical context, and I really like this painting that was done in eastern North Dakota to depict what about 200 to 300,000 bison would look like on a relatively small area. The painter John McStanley, who did this in about the 1850s, I think this really helps me get my head around what sort of grazing activity was going on this landscape prior to the massive human settlement. Of course, we know we had elk grazing, we have grasshoppers grazing, and we had small mammals grazing as well. But what this helps me to do is really see that there was all this defoliation going on, and our wildlife, especially our grassland birds, were finding areas to nest in there, and our pollinators were thriving in this environment as well. Next slide. I also want to point out, historically speaking, there were uncontrolled wildfires across the landscape, and we know specifically that the interaction of those wildfires and grazing was important and was providing good structure and good habitat. And again, our wildlife species were thriving and surviving in this type of environment. As you read historical accounts, it talks about how there were bison and elk wandering around who had been burned and they had singed fur and skin. It's somewhat dramatic to read that, but to me that's really important to understand that there was this grazing and fire interactions going on the landscape. In addition, we also know that our wildlife had to be able to thrive and function under the climate variations in this part of the world too. We have often pretty warm summers and obviously very cold winters in this part of the world. So essentially those are the three legs of the stool that I look at as far as the major ecological processes are: grazing, fire, and climate. Next slide. I really like this quote. This really articulates what I'm trying to say about how wildlife are embedded in this burning and grazing processes. This was taken out from this book in the lower left-hand corner, The Nature of Eastern North Dakota, pre-1880 Historical Ecology. And let me just read this quote. All evidence suggests that eastern North Dakota was composed of a patchy, heterogeneous array of plant communities that continually was changing in response to climate, fire, and herbivory. Thus, on a landscape scale, species and community diversity was high. Now, if you talk to us prairie wildlife folks, you'll hear us talking in words like patchy, heterogeneous, mosaic. We get excited about that. We don't look at the landscape. It shouldn't be just a monotypic stand of vegetation. It should be more of this patchiness that this quote is articulating. Next slide. Now I think this is a great diagram to think about grazing and the birds. This is from a Sampson and Knopf, a somewhat famous prairie article from 1997. As you can see across the top, there is the excessive to no grazing at all, and on the bottom is the vegetative response, bare ground up to some small shrubs. And you can see the listed bird species, how they need, again, that mosaic, patchiness, heterogeneity, right? If we have a monotype of all bare ground, we're only going to be providing habitat for a small section of the birds. The chestnut-colored longspur, Sprague's pipit, and Baird sparrows are some of our priority species of conservation. So as you can see, if you look at their ranges, they aren't going to go over into this shrubby area. Again, keep in mind we aren't talking about huge trees generally. These are just smaller shrubs. Next slide, please. Taking this a little bit further, I wanted to talk about structure as we think about this patchiness and heterogeneity, and I've thrown up some examples here. In the wildlife world, when we talk about structure, we're talking about visual obstruction reading, or Robel poles, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. In this picture in the upper left, the surveyor is looking at a Robel pole here, and we measure our visual obstruction readings on that Robel pole when the pole is completely covered up by the vegetation. You can no longer see the pole. And then we can equate that number we read on the pole to what some of the preferences for our breeding species. So what type of cover are they going to want to nest in? What is the thickness of that cover, essentially? So I've provided some examples that these are all priorities for us in Fish and Wildlife Service here in the Dakotas. The mallard, a species that's pretty familiar, I think, to a lot of us, they like pretty thick cover. So, and these are averages. Each species has a range, of course, but just for example, today I wanted to give you an estimated number. So about almost 30 inches is what the mallard prefers. As we get down to the sharp-tailed grouse, which is a non-migratory species that has to stick around in the winter here, they are at about 19 inches. Bobolink, 17.8. Grasshopper sparrow, 15.1. And the upland sandpiper, 9.2. Now, again, my point here is to show you the need for that mosaic and that patchiness. You have the upland sandpiper, which is 3 times less than what the mallard needs. Again, all of these species function on the landscape, but they need a little bit different structure. Next slide, please. One thing that in pristine times when there were uncontrolled wildfires and free-ranging ungulates all over the place, we know that our grassland obligate species, they thrived. But in this modern-day landscape and thinking about the whole novel ecosystems concept, how are our wildlife reacting to our management that we're doing? Because sometimes we have these postage stamps that are surrounded by cropland, or we have a lot more fragmented habitat, we have more invasive species, climate change, and all those considerations. So we conducted a study with our partners at U.S. Geological Survey in Jamestown, North Dakota here to take about 120 units of prairie and look at the bird response when we managed those using burning and grazing. So how does burning and grazing affect the birds? This took place for about 3 years from 2011 until 2013. So we found out that bobolinks were 96.9%, were found on 96.9% of our mixed grass prairie units surveyed. We saw increased densities in this species in growing seasons after we did a burn or graze treatment. So essentially that's what we'd expect to happen, so it's good to validate our assumptions. Grasshopper sparrows were on 98.4% of mixed grass units surveyed, and densities were highest in units with graze treatment regime and lowest in units that were rested greater than equal to 5 years. Now, I think it's worth mentioning, we were talking a little bit about this before the webinar officially started, but our prairies across the Dakotas, we have a long-term history of rest where we didn't graze or burn. In about the 1960s, we believed that it was good to idle prairies. We thought that that was good for the wildlife. And we've changed this paradigm in about the mid-90s or so. And so a lot of our prairies do have this long-time history of rest. So again, we're validating that we cannot rest our prairies. We need to be burning and grazing them. I also want to mention my co-author on this presentation, Lori Richardson, has been able to see increased barred sparrows when she does a lot of grazing on her units up at Losswood. And there's a specific unit they're looking at now where it's been amazing the number of barred sparrows that have shown up after their grazing regime. Okay, next slide. I've talked a lot about the birds and talked a lot about structure and that patchiness. Of course, I always say that that your vegetative composition is going to drive your structure. But I also think when we start looking at the butterflies and the bees, we really get into the importance of the vegetative composition because, of course, these species need certain nectar and larval species. And I think as we've seen this whole monarch initiative across the country, that's pretty evident. Next slide. So I want to talk a little bit specific what our prairies look like with Fish and Wildlife Service in the Dakotas in northeastern Montana, considering these species that we're trying to provide habitat for. So I have a picture for you of a high-quality native prairie on our lands, and I hope you're seeing that patchiness or that mosaic that I've been talking about. We've got our hilltop. You all know that's little blue stem probably. All this light green, that's lead plant, an amazing abundance of that on this site, and even some shrubby trees. So this, I would be happy if all of our prairies looked like this. This is about as good as it gets on our prairies, but we have very little of this. Next slide, please. Unfortunately, most of our prairies look like this. They are currently highly invaded with cool season invasive grasses, mostly smooth brome and Kentucky bluegrass. And as you can see, this picture on the left is mostly Kentucky bluegrass that is pretty much a monotype. You're missing that patchiness. There's a little thistle in there and silverleaf scurf pea, but it's pretty much a monotype. And even though in the other picture we do get some of our higher floristic forbs like the pasqueflower, you can see that it's embedded in that Kentucky bluegrass. Next slide. So again, to validate, we did a survey of all of our prairies in North Dakota, South Dakota, and northeastern Montana. This was 220,000 acres of just our native prairie lands. That's not all of our lands, that's our native prairie, so lands that have never been cultivated. And here are the results. Here's our percent frequency, and here are our plant groupings on the x-axis. So as you can see, our native grass and forb groupings, unfortunately that's not 100%, and we're not surprised by that. But actually the invasion of smooth brome and Kentucky bluegrass was worse than we expected. As you can see, these two species in the middle, they are making up more than 50% of the composition of our prairies alone, and that's not even adding in crested wheat or the weedy forbs. Next slide, please. So what do we have available to try to improve our prairies across the two states? Well, we don't have uncontrolled wildfires, and we don't have free-ranging ungulates generally. But we can use prescribed fires. We have specially trained people that can go out and safely do fires. We have crews of them that can go out and do that. And also, fortunately, most of us have the opportunity to have grazing cooperators that can come on our lands and help us meet our objectives for managing, whether that be structural or improving our vegetative composition. The one challenge we can't always manage ideally, considering some of the constraints with burning and grazing. With a prescribed fire, we have to be very careful. The weather has to be just right. And also, it's pretty expensive to do burning treatments in a safe way. Our funding for fire keeps getting cut. So again, we have some serious constraints that we can't just burn to our heart's desire to meet the objectives for our land management. As far as grazing is actually, we have better opportunities to graze than we do to burn right now in the two states. Some of our folks are limited because they're in more cropland-dominated areas and they don't have grazing animals nearby to be able to do that. Some other constraints associated with grazing, if your grazer closest to your land management unit only has a certain number of cattle or calves at the time of the year that you would like to be going out on your prairie to graze to meet a certain objective, those are some constraints that we might have. Or if they have to travel, bring their cattle a long ways and so on. There are some constraints to totally living in an idyllic world considering these two management tools. Next slide. So we want to make sure that when we do use these management tools, we are using them in the most scientifically based way that's going to help us meet our management objectives. And most of the time our management objective is to help with that structure as well as increase our native plants and reduce those cool season invasive grasses, mainly smooth brome and Kentucky bluegrass. So we came up with this process called the Native Prairie Adaptive Management Approach. And what we do every year, 120 prairies are enrolled in this across Minnesota, North Dakota, South Dakota, and northeastern Montana. We'll manage each of these sites using either burning, grazing, or we will idle these prairies sometimes. And then we all monitor them using the same protocol. We upload all of this management monitoring data into a centralized database, which does some fancy statistics and some analysis for us. We evaluate that, and then we generate management recommendations based on those outcomes of our management from previous years. This feedback loop will continue on. We started this in 2009, and we anticipate that this will keep going over the long term. Next slide, please. Next slide. So as part of this process, this adaptive management process, here are our main questions we're trying to address with this. We're trying to figure out what may influence our burning and grazing effectiveness. Number one, does a dominant invader, whether it's smooth brome or Kentucky bluegrass, how much of an influence is that in our burning or grazing effectiveness? Number two, more recent and or frequent defoliation. What is the influence on our burning and grazing effectiveness considering that? For example, if we have a unit that we left idle for 20 years and now we're starting to manage it more frequently and more aggressively, what does that mean for your outcomes in terms of increasing your native plants and decreasing your non-native plants? Number three, the current degree of invasion. How does this influence your burning or grazing effectiveness? This is a threshold question. At what point is that brome or bluegrass taken over that prairie that no matter how much or at what time you burn or graze, are you going to be able to bring back those native plants? And number four, the timing. How does the timing affect the effectiveness of burning or grazing? Of course, and then number five is the catch-all. We know this won't be simple to answer all these questions. There's probably a combination of a few of the above, all the above, or none of the above. But we'll keep working on this feedback loop to see if we can answer these questions to improve our prairies. Next slide. So we care about the birds, pollinators, and other grassland-dependent wildlife. Historical and current data indicate that we need defoliation like grazing and burning to maintain both the structure and composition on our prairies. We are systematically trying to use grazing and burning and learn more about the cool season invasive grasses that plague this region. That's all I have at this time.
All right, thanks, Cammie. And just for those of you who are listening, we'll if you send your questions in through the chat, then we'll take some time at the end of the presentations to answer them. So our next presenter is Jeff Moseley. Jeff is a professor of range science and extension management, range management specialist at Montana State University in Bozeman. One of the things that Jeff didn't put on here, but I know, is that Jeff is a previous president of the Society for Range Management. And Jeff's going to talk to us today a little bit about some principles with the use of targeted grazing in developing wildlife habitat. So with that, I'll turn it over to you, Jeff.
Thank you, John. So you can go ahead and move on to the next slide. And as John said, we're going to start off talking a little bit about principles, a quick review, and then go into some guidelines and with some examples from some of our work and others. I think there's three things you want to remind yourself or be thinking about when you start thinking about trying to use targeted livestock grazing to benefit wildlife. One, habitat essentials. Two, the concept of limiting factor. And then three, the fact that trade-offs need to be made. So to begin, again, it's just a quick review. When you think about wildlife habitat, as a framework for thinking about it, if you can think about the idea that there are four habitat essentials: food, water, cover, and space. So if we're going to affect wildlife habitat, we're going to focus in on one or more of those. Next slide, please. And then we get to the idea of the limiting factor. And again, this concept that many people are familiar with, learned about it in some distant biology class. But oftentimes when we get to the point where we're involved in trying to use targeted livestock grazing for wildlife habitat improvement or any kind of wildlife habitat improvement, sometimes this concept gets lost. The best way that I know to try to explain it is, and what's trying to be depicted here in this slide, is the idea of wooden slats in a barrel. So if you have a barrel and it's comprised of these different wooden slats, the volume that can be held in that barrel is limited by the lowest slat. So if we think here in this picture where we have the 4 habitat essentials, food, water, cover, and space, there's a certain amount of population that can be sustained, and in this case it's going to be limited then by the lowest slat. And this example here in the slide is showing that food is that. So you can do all you want, and you might feel good about it. You could increase cover, improve cover. You could improve water. You could provide more space. But in this example, unless you affect food, unless you raise that slat, the population doesn't change. Next slide, please. So then if you think about the limiting factor being, in this case, food, then it has to become more specific. It may be the quantity of the food. It might be the protein content, might be the energy content, might be the accessibility of that food, or some other factors, some other features. And so again, even if you have identified food as the limiting factor, and you're going to try to improve that, what season is that? And then what's showing in this example is that protein is in the food is what's limiting. So you could do all you want in improving the quantity, but you wouldn't have any real effect on the population. So before we start to try to benefit wildlife, we have to spend quite a bit of time trying to figure out what the limiting factor is and get as specific as we can, and then see if there's a way to target that. And we might find that livestock are not a viable tool for that particular limiting factor. But until we identify it, we might not really be effective. Next slide, please. So to summarize it, habitat improvement will only benefit a population when the limiting habitat essential is improved. So unless you raise that lowest slat in the barrel, again, you might feel good, it might look good, but you really haven't accomplished anything. Next slide, please. There's also a couple of difficult points that we have to come to grips with. The first is that trade-offs are part of this game, and that's because it's impossible to maximize habitat quality for wildlife. And we talk about wildlife habitat improvement. We're going to maximize wildlife. Well, that's not realistic. In fact, it's impossible. And the reason is in the second box there, because anytime you change the habitat, any one of those habitat essentials, you inevitably, simultaneously, make the habitat more like what a certain kind of fauna or group of fauna like or prefer or need. And when you do that, when you move it, you move that needle one way, you move it closer to something, but you inevitably, simultaneously, every time move it away, move that needle away from what something else needs or what something else prefers. And that is a difficult thing for a lot of folks to face, because if you start trying to improve wildlife habitat for certain species, you are degrading it for another. Now, as we were just talking about, you can change the habitat, you can change the habitat essential. You don't degrade the habitat meaningfully for a species unless you degrade its limiting factor. So there is a lot of room there to alter the habitat, but as soon as you alter it in a way that you affect the lowest slat, then you're going to have the point. You're going to create the situation where you are significantly degrading that habitat for something else. That means you have to spend a lot of time in planning and come to grips with the fact that if I'm going to improve habitat for something, I have to admit that I'm going to degrade it for something else. Because of this difficulty, a lot of people end up moving towards, instead of identifying certain species, moving toward a goal of maximizing or optimizing diversity. And we'll talk about that near the end. Next slide, please. Just to reinforce this, using the same slide that Cami just presented, this idea then that there are different species out there with all different niches, they all have different habitat requirements. As soon as you move that vegetation to be more what one species needs, then you move it away from what another species needs. And unless you can provide the heterogeneity, the patchiness on the landscape where all these different features are present in large enough amounts and in the right juxtaposition or the right connectedness to each other, then you're going to make the habitat better suited to some species and less suited to others. Next slide, please. So if we get into some guidelines then for once you've decided what it is you want to do, and you look at your habitat, and what I've got here now are a series of slides that just talk about how you would actually go about this. So again, looking at life forms, so culm grasses, the grasses that have stems, the bunch grasses and such, versus culmless grasses, the rhizomatous grasses primarily we were talking about, sod formers. So we know, based on decades and decades of research and experience, what type of grazing use will favor these. So if you've decided that you want to try to favor culm grasses, and you have some in the habitat, those species are favored by grazing use that occurs after seed set of those culm grasses, and also by late season shrub use. If you're trying to favor culmless grasses, they're favored most by early season use and late season shrub use. Next slide, please. If you're trying to favor shrubs or late cereal forbs, the later successional forbs, or the early cereal forbs, the pioneer forbs, the early invader forbs, they again have different timings of year when grazing can occur that will favor each of them. So, for example, early cereal forbs, we have lots of past experience with that. All you need to do is hit it hard early in the season, and you can generate quite a few early cereal forbs. But so again, to pick out what it is you're trying to benefit whichever species you're trying to benefit, and then design the grazing timing and intensity to match that. Next, please. Give you a couple of examples here then. So the first one for sage grouse, as you know, very important bird across much of the West, an iconic bird, and one of the limitations that's facing sage grouse is that in many places we have too much sagebrush cover, and sage grouse typically do best when the sagebrush cover is 10 to 25%, and yet we have many stands across the West that exceed 30%. And when that happens, then you reduce the understory. You don't get the weedy forbs that the broods need, and you don't get the arthropods, the insects that the broods need. And much research has shown that brood rearing is probably a limiting factor for many sage grouse populations. So one of the ways to reduce sagebrush cover using targeted livestock grazing is moderate use during the fall with localized heavy trampling. And go to the next slide, John, and show you an example of this. This is some work that we're doing right now in southwestern Montana, right on the Montana-Idaho border, and grazing in the fall with cattle, and then using crystallix tubs, low moisture block supplement tubs, to concentrate use in small little areas, creating patchiness. And we can take that sagebrush cover right around the tub we're going from 35% down to 0, and then thinning it out in the surrounding area around the tub, not trying to eradicate it, but trying to take it down to 15% or so. And then overall in that whole patch, then having a more moderate amount of sagebrush cover, stimulating the weedy forbs for the broods and the arthropods for the broods. Next slide, please. Cammie talked about structure, and got here 2 slides that talk about 4 different kinds of structure. So looking at if you've decided that the desired structure you have is a mixed, tall and short but homogeneous, so certain species would be favored by that. So you have tall and short, but it's a mixture of tall and short over a large area. Well, the strategy that matches up with that will help create that and maintain it is moderate use with moderate selectivity. In contrast, if you're looking to try to create patches of tall vegetation, then you need the animals to be more selective, and you need a lighter stocking rate and lighter utilization. Next slide, please. 2 more different kinds of structure, desired structure. You might desire for some species an homogeneous tall structure. Well, in that case, you're going to want some exclusion, definitely some periodic rest, and probably some light use. Conversely, if you're looking to create that habitat for plovers and others where you want that short, homogeneous vegetation, well, the only way to do that is to create fairly moderate to heavy use and with low selectivity. Next slide, please. Another example then with sage grouse, again, broods and the need for those new chicks, young chicks, to be eating forbs, to be getting an abundance of them, as well as to have them accessible. And some work done years ago in Nevada and other places worked this out, that light to moderate grazing use by cattle or sheep in spring and summer leads to that, and that sage grouse broods actually prefer when the vegetation is 2 to 6 inches high, and that once you get out away from the shrubs where they're hiding, that in order to access the forbs and to access the insects, that the vegetation needs to be short. Next slide, please. Another example, this one is from wild ungulates, and you may want to try to increase browse quality in winter. This can be done with moderate use during the preceding early summer. And we did some work on this years ago that showed that if you graze it in early summer, the shrubs then would regrow, and that new growth would be nutritious. It would be higher in protein content and lower in fiber. If, however, we grazed the areas in late summer, then it occurred too late in the growing season, and then going into winter, the plants were actually higher in fiber and lower in protein. So that timing and the intensity are really important. Next slide, please. Another example, wild ungulates. We've done a lot of work in trying to improve mule deer and elk habitat. It's focusing on spring forage and trying to reduce the standing dead grass then. And what we found is moderate herb use during the preceding summer, moderate use of grasses and forbs during the preceding summer provides the habitat that the elk and mule deer prefer. They avoid areas that are ungrazed by cattle, and they do not prefer areas that are heavily used by cattle, nor do they prefer areas that are lightly used by cattle. But they actually are selecting the areas moderately used during the preceding summer because it creates the forage conditions that enable the elk and the mule deer to optimize their foraging efficiency. Next slide. So I'll finish up here with just 3 more quick slides that get back to this idea of diversity, that if you're not willing to focus in on trying to benefit sage grouse, or not willing to the exclusion of others, or elk or mule deer, that one of the things you can do is to try to increase overall plant diversity. And so, again, as you're looking at your landscape, if look at how the livestock are grazing. If they're selectively consuming competitively inferior plants, then the only way to really have much diversity is to exclude livestock, because diversity declines at all grazing intensities. Next slide. Next slide, please. And so then, if you're looking at plants, excuse me, if livestock are selectively consuming competitively dominant plant species, then diversity is favored by moderate or heavy use. And then the last one, if the dominant plant species are grazing tolerant, and you want to create increased diversity, you need moderate to heavy use. If you have less grazing tolerant plants that dominate, then you're going to have lighter use. And a pretty good guiding principle is that plant diversity is optimized, is maximized at 40 to 60% grazing utilization. And when the plants are more tolerant, it's closer to the 60% level. And when the plants are less grazing tolerant, it's closer to the 40% level. But that's been worked out in lots of different ecosystems. The plant species diversity is maximized under moderate utilization, which is the 40 to 60%. So next slide, John, just wrap me up and turn it back to you.
All right, thanks a lot, Jeff. Our next talk is going to be by Pat Johnson. Pat is a professor at South Dakota State University, West River Ag Center. As I mentioned in the earlier report, Pat and I have a project together in South Dakota where we're looking at livestock grazing and prairie dogs. Pat's been at South Dakota State since 1986, and Pat is one of the five women to get a fellow award by the Society of Range Management. So with that, I'll turn it over to you, Pat.
Thanks, John, and thanks for making me sound so old. Anyway, go ahead. Yeah, thanks. We're doing some research where we're looking at heterogeneity and how we might be able to manage for heterogeneity on a more landscape scale. And as has been well mentioned and previously, heterogeneity is particularly valuable in providing habitat for a wide variety of wildlife species. If you have a very homogeneous plant community, it will be beneficial for some species, but certainly others won't be able to utilize it well. And this is especially true for migratory grassland bird species. And we find in the northern Great Plains that we have a lot of species of grassland birds that nest in the northern Great Plains, and many of those species are declining in populations. Big concern is providing adequate habitat for them, and especially nesting habitat. So we have a number of species like the curlew, which prefers the short grass plant communities, but then you get into the grouse, which prefer the taller grasses for their nesting habitat. So next slide.
Just 1 second, Pat. My computer acted up on me.
Well, I'll go ahead and keep talking about the thing. We'll see if the slides will catch up.
Right.
We have several issues that we deal with when we're talking about developing heterogeneity on grasslands. And one of those is that our focus in terms of grazing management in recent years has been on more uniform use of vegetation through rotational grazing. And so we see an increase in stocking density, oftentimes an increase in stocking rate, and it yields maximum production per acre. But very often we see a decline in heterogeneity across the landscape, and so that limits the habitat that we can have for the birds and other wildlife species. So one of the things that folks have been utilizing to help increase that diversity is to do patch burning, and this is quite popular down in the southern Great Plains. It's also been used to some extent in the northern plains. But and it's very effective at creating what they call a shifting mosaic of habitat for wildlife. And so we see that the patches are burned every or about 20% of the land would be burned, and then another 20% the following year. Livestock, of course, are going to be interested in going to those burned areas because they'll be very green in the spring, very little standing material, and it allows the cattle to perform as ecosystem engineers so that they're focusing. We're on the right slide now, so that we're focusing, or they are focusing on keeping the vegetation that, in the burned area fairly short, while the standing dead in the unburned areas are still there for in providing habitat for those species that require that higher structure. They've found that it's very beneficial for grassland bird habitat. They've also determined that the livestock do quite well on these systems. The problem that we run into in the northern Great Plains, at least in the area that I'm in, is that fire is incredibly unpopular. People just don't like it. Next slide, please. Basically, with patch burning, 20 to 25% of the area is burned, and as I said, the cattle will focus on that burned area as it greens up. But the burning creates issues for many people, and especially in private land states, because they fear loss of control of that burn. If I'm burning on my land and my burn goes over onto your land, I am liable for damages, for paying for fences and possibly for forage that has been burned up, and of course any liability in terms of safety issues for people and animals and so forth. The other thing that is of concern is that we're in a semi-arid region, and we have droughts quite often. And so if you burn vegetation that's left over from the last summer, you're burning vegetation that could be the bulk of the forage that you will have available to your livestock in the next summer if a drought is occurring. And so they're very concerned about not losing forage and not just burning it up and making ash out of it. So next slide, please. Okay. So we thought we'd try looking at creating patches differently, and that would be with grazing as opposed to burning. And we decided that the best way to do this would be to graze patches in the winter using cows that are non-lactating and pregnant. So you get fully grown cows, which would have the lowest nutritional requirements of the entire year for them, and heavily grazed patches during the winter, providing supplement in order for that to go well. And then open those patches up. You would have to, of course, put electric fence to keep them where you want them to graze the patch. But in the grazing season, you would remove that fence and allow the cattle access to both the grazed or the patch and the non-patch areas. Next slide, please. So just diagrammatically, I'll show you what we're doing in a study that we've been conducting at the Cottonwood Station. There we have 4 pastures. Each pasture is split in half. One half is control, so it has no patch in it, and the other half is our winter patch grazed pasture. And in that pasture, each year we will graze 1/5 of the pasture in the winter. Next slide, please. So in 2012, we had our cattle grazing patch number 1, which again is 20% of the pasture. And then next slide. 2013, we had them graze a different patch, and that can be continued on for, so we'd have a 5-year rotation. Next slide. And then in the summer of both years, the fence was removed from the patch area, and the pasture was, all these pastures were grazed by separate herds of steers. And just so that we be clear, each patch pasture had its own herd of steers, so the control pastures and the patch pastures were grazed separately. So we had 8 herds of steers out there grazing in 2012 and then in 2013. Next slide. And so this is what we ended up with. We have a patch, and we did it nice and rectangular, so nothing round like you might expect a fire perhaps to go in. But you can see there's a great difference between the patch, which is very, very green in the spring, because there's very little standing dead, compared to the areas that were not winter grazed. Next slide. And then we put, in the summer, we put steers out on these pastures, and we had a subset of them fitted with GPS collars so we could see where they spent their time. And on the right side is a GPS view of our pasture 6. The top of that is the control pasture, and the bottom is our patch grazed pasture. And you can see in the control pasture, they wandered around quite a bit, didn't seem to really focus on any part of the pasture. But in the patch pasture at the bottom, they really focused on the patch number 1, which was the patch that had been grazed the previous winter. Next slide, please. And so if we look at that, just that patch over time, we can see that the cattle in week 1, which would be about mid-May, that was when they were first put into the pasture, they really concentrated on that patch. They went for that nice green grass growing there. By week 5, which would be, June, probably about the middle to end of June, we still see the cattle focusing on the patch, but by the time we get to about August, which is the week 10 in this, they had started spending quite a bit of time off the patch and in other parts of the pasture. Next slide, please. So what did we find out? Well, with the winter patch grazing, we were able to determine that we had no difference in animal weight gains between the cattle on the pasture and the cattle on the control pastures in either year. Next slide. Vegetation structure was shorter in our patch pastures than they were in the control pastures, and this is across the pasture. So it's not quite as dramatic. If we had focused, or if we'd presented just the vegetation structure on the patch, it would be shorter yet. But we had a significant decline in the structure in 2013. And next slide. We also looked at bird abundance on these pastures and determined much higher bird abundance. That's just the number of birds detected either by sight or by sound on the winter grazed pastures compared to the control pastures. And the next slide. We looked at diversity as well. In 2012, we did not have any significant difference in diversity. However, in 2013, our diversity on the winter patch pastures was higher. And the next slide is the last one. What we are doing now is we're working on a new project funded by North Central Region's SARE program, and we're going to continue the rotation through our patches at the Cottonwood Station. And we're also including producers who have more production-sized pastures than we have. Our pastures, prior to splitting in half, were somewhere between 120 and 180 acres, whereas our producers have pastures that are much, much larger, up to a section in size for some of them. And the other thing, instead of just looking at where animals spend their time, we're also going to be utilizing technology to look at where they are actually spending their time grazing. So where are they actually doing the most of their grazing? And we're also starting to look at the effects of that winter grazing period on the cows as they're grazing those winter patches. And that's a critical feature when you're dealing with cow-calf operations, because we can't have a treatment or a situation where we create problems for the cow in terms of her weight, body condition score, or her reproductive performance. at some point, assuming that the winter patch grazing proves to be useful, we would need to do a comparison between that and patch burn grazing. And one other thing that we'd really like to do but don't have the funding for it at this point is to look at the forage and diet quality on patches in terms of what the cattle are able to acquire on those patches versus off patches. And that's all I have.
Well, thanks, Pat, and I apologize for that glitch. I don't know what happened. All at once my computer shut off there, so Karen could recover it for us. So thanks a lot. And so I don't know, was there any questions that came in for our presenters?
We have one question here, John. This has been super interesting, and Janessa has a question.
Well, one came over a line and asked if Jeff could share the citation for the research on the brood rearing habitat in Nevada.
Sure. John and Karen, what's the best way for me to try to get that out? It's actually it's in the wildlife chapter of the Targeted Grazing Handbook. If that we could highlight that, or I can.
Just tell us a little bit about it, and we've got this Targeted Grazing Handbook out. We're getting it, and maybe we'll be able to find the actual reference.
Okay. Well, there's a couple different ones. The work was led by Don Klebanow when he was at the University of Nevada, and he had a series of graduate students. I can remember their last names, but not all of their first names. But Neal and Evans and Oakleaf, I believe, are the three. And then Don Klebanow presented it in various places subsequently, but most of that work was done in the late 70s, early 1980s.
Yeah, we're looking for it. I don't know what the lead author is.
Well, there should be three different master's theses.
Okay, right. Okay, so one is that's right.
Oakleaf, Neal, and Evans are the ones that come to my mind.
So I would say we can send those out. We can put them on the Targeted Grazing website, but also I've got the Targeted Grazing website up here. If anyone wanted to see this, they could go to this chapter that Jeff wrote in the Targeted Grazing Handbook here, which is 13.
Yeah.
And that's it would be here. So if anyone wanted to follow these up, just go to the literature cited section. And actually, many of the comments that the topics that you covered today are covered in this chapter, so that's a good follow-up. But Evans is one of them, which is right here. Right?
Yep.
And the other ones were?
Neal and Oakleaf are the ones that come to my mind.
Okay,
N-E-L.
Here we go. There's Neal and Oakleaf right there.
Yeah.
So those are theses out of Reno, Nevada. And again, I'd recommend anyone go ahead and take a look at this chapter in the Targeted Grazing Handbook as a kind of a source for that. Okay, and Janessa has some other questions here coming in. Thanks, Jeff.
Is rangeland health being monitored for the patch grazing study?
Yes. Yes, it is. We are collecting the data that would be appropriate for evaluating that. So, yes, we are collecting rangeland health information.
Okay, and then, Jeff, I do have a question. While you were presenting, you mentioned that cover for the sage grouse with 2 to 6 inches. Was that for forbs or grasses? And is that in the targeted grazing section with the wildlife section in the targeted grazing book?
Yeah, it is. So, and that's a guideline for broods when they are foraging, that they need short vegetation, and that the shorter vegetations, typically has more of the weedy forbs that they need and prefer, as well as the types of insects that they need and prefer are found on with shorter vegetation, weedier vegetation with a fair amount of bare ground interspersed. And real tall, dense vegetation is important for concealment, certainly right around nests, which are almost exclusively right underneath sagebrush plants. And then once the birds get a little bit bigger and they're foraging out around those nests, the dense, thick grass vegetation is actually impervious and not beneficial. So you need you need both. And
Jeff, you raised a good point. In your presentation, you said that if you improve habitat for one species, it degrades it for another. And what you're describing now is even if you improve it for one part of the life cycle of one species, it might not be what they need in another life cycle.
Exactly. That's a great point. Yep. And so, trying to provide, knowing enough about these different species and their different life cycle needs, and trying to provide those at the right time. I'll give you one quick example. So this one study I showed you a picture of, it's up on the Montana-Idaho border. It's brood rearing habitat. It's not lekking or breeding habitat, not nesting habitat. So the idea for meeting nesting habitat guidelines in that area is pointless. In other areas, breeding, nesting, and brood rearing are all in the same area. And then you got a little bit bigger challenge, but then you're looking at trying to create that patchiness to provide all those different needs.
Good point.
Okay, great. Thanks, Jeff. I do have a question for Pat and Cammie, though. I myself have done a little bit of work in the Dakotas with the Forest Service, but I was curious, have you guys done anything with the black-footed ferrets or the prairie dogs with burning and grazing, and how you manage some of those? How do you manage those type of wildlife? I know, Cammie, you focus more on the songbirds, but what about the ferrets and the prairie dogs?
Well, I can jump in on that. This is Pat. We have done some work looking at the interaction between livestock and prairie dogs, and a lot of it the study that John and I are working on right now, we're trying to look at the possibility that there might be value to livestock production by having prairie dogs as part of the mix, because they do create that patch of very green vegetation, and cattle get a high-quality diet off of it. But what we're trying to do then is to look at how much time they spend on prairie dog towns grazing versus off towns, and looking at the quality of the diet and so forth. Ken Olson is heavily involved in that, and hopefully we'll have some information out about that here pretty soon. Other work that we've done is looking at how much competition there is between prairie dogs and livestock. And what we've found is that on prairie dog towns, prairie dogs remove the vast majority of the forage. They're responsible for that removal. Cattle basically get about half as much forage from a prairie dog town as they would from an off-town site of the same ecological site. So, if you've got a clay site with a prairie dog town on it, and a clay site that is off-town that doesn't have a prairie dog town on it, cattle will get twice as much from the off-town site, forage-wise, as they will from the on-town site. So modifying stocking rates to avoid overgrazing those off-town sites could be useful, certainly in reducing the overgrazing in the pasture, and hopefully maintaining prairie dogs in an area without having them expand dramatically. Certainly we can't do anything about drought, which is when they expand quite a bit, but during average to above average years, if you reduce your stocking rate based on livestock, however many acres you have of prairie dogs, reducing the carrying capacity of those by half is a pretty good start to allowing them to coexist.
Good, great, Pat. Cammie, did you have anything to add on that?
Most of the work that I'm doing, we are east of the Missouri River, so we don't have too many prairie dog towns. So no, we aren't focusing on that. Other areas in our region, we do have a focus on introducing black-footed ferrets and looking at that sort of thing, but we aren't quite thinking of the grazing in the way you're asking, I think.
Okay. Well, that's all we have of questions coming in on the web. John, I don't know if you have some other ones or if you want to just bring this to conclusion.
No, I'd just like to bring up one thing. Pat mentioned that the interaction there with the prairie dog and livestock. We are going to have a special issue of Rangelands coming out in February that's focusing a lot on that project. And one of some of the information that she mentioned, Ken Olson, looking at the time cattle spend on prairie dog towns, and will be in that issue. So that should be coming out again in February. But I don't have a lot to add. I'd just again like to thank our presenters today. I thought it was really interesting. I really appreciate them being willing to take the time to talk about these things.
Well, John, we all want to second it here in my office. This was a really great session. I would just like to remind all the readers that if you want to learn more about this targeted grazing handbook is available online on our website. Our website is targetedgrazing.wordpress.com. Also, you could direct friends and colleagues to our training workshops. So this is where we put the presentations from the past. You can view them on YouTube, and you can see that January 14 is our next one, where John Walker will talk about multi-species grazing. So with that, from the Society for Range Management Targeted Grazing Committee, really appreciate these great speakers and all of you for participating. Have a great rest of the day.